Have you ever looked up at the clouds and seen a face in the clouds? And you've even been able to tell if it was a happy face or a sad face or an angry face? Well, we tend to see faces everywhere. And a new study actually shines light on what's happening inside our brains when we see a face, even in an inanimate object or something that's obviously not a human face. And so let's look at this article from Science Alert. They say, here's why we tend to see faces everywhere we look, according to science. We know that our minds can imagine faces everywhere there's a hint of two eyes and a nose, from cloud formations to car bonnets and plug sockets. If they say car bonnets, they're obviously not from the US. That's the hood, by the way. To plug sockets. And it's technically known as face pareidolia. A new study gives us insight into what's actually going on in the brain when this happens. Scientists wanted to know whether the brain processes these imagined faces in the same way as real human faces. And it turns out there are some similarities in how we perceive and interpret them. The research suggests that false faces found through pareidolia are assessed in the same way as a real face would be. Yeah, that makes total sense. Somehow, the same neural circuitry is involved in figuring out what a face is doing, even though we know that what we're looking at in a tree stump or a TV remote isn't a real face. We know that these objects are not truly faces, yet the perception of a face lingers, says psychologist David Allice from the University of Sydney in Australia. We end up with something strange, a parallel experience that is both a compelling face and also an object, two things at once. The first impression of a face does not give way to the second perception of an object. And I don't know about you, but once I see a face in something, like they're showing in this example in this article, like on these clocks or a bag or in your coffee, I can't unsee it. I'm always looking at that face, even though I know it's just a coffee or a clock or whatever. I can't unsee that face. I'm always looking at it as a face from that point on. So Elias and his colleagues asked 17 volunteers to look at a series of dozens of illusory and human faces repeated several times over, then rate the strength of emotion in each one through the same computer software. And this is really interesting because, again, you can look at these inanimate objects on the screen right now, and you can say like, oh, that water jug looks really mad. That pepper looks angry. That clock and that coffee look really happy. And it's really interesting how we can project an emotional state onto an inanimate object based on looking at what looks like a face. And I think that's the interesting part here, because obviously we depend on human facial expressions a lot for figuring out what to do in our social lives. And if I had to guess, because I'm not a researcher on human faces or anything like that, but if I had to guess, I would say that when we're born as children, we're dependent on other people in order to survive, even more than we are when we're adults. Of course, we're all interconnected and all that. But when you're a child, you're obviously much more dependent on other people for your food and for your shelter, etc. And so we have to know, like, is this person angry? Should I stop doing this thing because it makes them feel this way? Is that person happy right now? Maybe I should do that more often because it helps my survival. And so I think that we have a really strong kind of software for reading human faces because it's really important for our survival and for our social lives. And so our brain is really good at making split-second reads on what faces are trying to tell us. And sometimes, obviously, what we think is wrong. And sometimes it's even not an actual face. I know when I was little, I used to kind of like, when it's dark, you kind of see like the outline of a person. When it's not, it's just kind of like maybe a broom leaning against the curtain or something like that, and you think it's a person, because it's probably better to assume that that's something that could be possibly dangerous and get away from it and survive than to just think, oh, nothing is wrong, that's obviously not a person, that's not a face, it's not angry, and then that person doesn't survive, and over time those differences in perceiving something there even though it's not probably helped us survive. Because assuming something is there and dealing with it means that if there is actually something there, then you're going to get away from it and you're going to survive. Whereas if you assume that, nothing's there, it's just an object, then maybe it actually is something and you don't survive. And again, over time, those differences in survival probably led to the mechanisms that we use to read faces now. Not sure about that, just my opinion. The researchers found that the study participant mostly agreed on the expressions that pareidolia faces were showing, and that bias crept in based on the expression of the previous face, something that we do with human faces too. So what that means is if you see an inanimate object and you see a face in it, and that face is happy, you tend to kind of think the next face is going to be happy as well. They say, in other words, a succession of happy faces makes us more likely to see the next one as happy as well. Yeah. That this bias was observed in both real and illusory faces suggests that the brain is processing them in a similar way and using similar neural networks. Here's the whole key to this study. Pareidolia faces are not discarded as false detections, but undergo facial expression analysis in the same way as real faces. So we analyze these faces in inanimate objects that we see the same way that we analyze an actual human face. We need to read the identity of the face and discern its expression. Are they a friend or a foe? Are they happy, sad, angry, or pained? The researchers point to the importance of facial expressions as social communication as the reason for why our brains are constantly recognizing faces and assessing their expressions. This is something that we do automatically all the time. It's easy for us. It's just normal for us to do it. It helps us determine what sort of situation we're in and what to do next, which is why our brains have learned to do it so quickly and with so little information. Just a hint of 2 eyes and a nose is perhaps enough. So that's really interesting. It doesn't have to even be a complete human face. It can just be a couple of things that kind of look like a face. Previous research into face pareidolia shows that certain biases that can affect our brains when it comes to human faces can also apply to imagined faces, backing up the idea that a face doesn't have to be real for higher level sensory mechanisms and visual processing to be activated. So your brain doesn't care if it's an imagined face or a real face. It's going to process whatever information is coming in quickly so that you have some information about what you should do in that environment. Even if you don't have to react to that fake face or that not real human face, I guess, it's still better to have that information quickly just in case than to not have it, which is probably why it happens. They continue to say that considering that pareidolia faces can be so varied and subtle, of all shapes and sizes and materials, unlike human faces, the brain is doing an impressive job at processing these visual signals so quickly. When objects look compellingly face-like, it is more than an interpretation. They really are driving your brain's face detection network, says Elias. And that scowl or smile, that's your brain's facial expression system at work. For the brain, fake or real, faces are all processed in the same way. That's how important human faces are to our lives and how important it is to your brain and the functioning of being a human being. So it's really interesting that human faces are so important to us, that we see them everywhere and we analyze those things that are not even human faces in the same way as you analyze the face of your actual cousin, brother, or father. And I think this is really interesting. Obviously, our faces and facial expressions are extremely important to our interactions. And I hope my facial expressions are showing you that I would like you to join me in future videos as well, because I think you're really cool. And I post a new video like this about a topic I think is interesting every single day at 7 a.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday. So I really genuinely hope you can see the genuineness. Hope to see you tomorrow morning for the next video as well. And even if you don't want to join me for that, I still hope you have an excellent rest of your day. This is genuine, I promise. Hopefully your brain can pick up on that.